In this episode, the featured film brings to the screen a story written by perhaps the most famous author of the 20th century, tells that story mostly from the inside of an equally famous train, and fills that train with an all-star cast for the ages. These stories and more from the 22nd row. Murder on the Orient Express was released in 1974. The genre is mystery, murder mystery, and perhaps puzzle murder mystery. The setting is Istanbul, Turkey, the East Asian side and the West European side, and for the most part, a train that travels between that same Istanbul to the port of Calais. It's no spoiler that for the purposes of our story, we don't get as far as Calais. The time of the film is approximately 1935, which makes this film a period piece. Once again, in this amazing period between 1970 and 1975, so many wonderful period movies were made, and I have no idea why, except perhaps to say that the talent behind all these films were at their peak and just kept releasing quality period movies one after the other for that 5-year period. Murder on the Orient Express is no exception. The source material for Murder on the Orient Express is a story by Agatha Christie, arguably the most famous author of the 20th century and perhaps arguably the most successful author of the 20th century. Now, her writing career spanned from about 1920 to approximately 1970. She was born into an upper middle class family in England, and I think was very typical of both her period and her upbringing. And she wrote very English, if I may say, very British stories throughout her career, all of them in the realm of the murder mystery, but a very particular kind of murder mystery. They were what you might call puzzle murder mysteries. Now, I'm a huge fan of Agatha Christie's stories, but with two disclaimers. The first one is, I love her stories, but I've read very few, perhaps less than 3 or 4. But I have seen almost all of her short stories that have been brought to either the television screen or the movie theater, and I've seen many of the stories that have been brought exclusively to the movies. So that's what it is. The second disclaimer is, I am on record as saying I love the private detective genre, the hard-boiled detective genre, and I have quoted from a very famous essay written by Raymond Chandler called The Simple Art of Murder, where in that essay he talks about the private detective, he talks about the genre of detective fiction, greats like himself, Dashiell Hammett, movies like The Maltese Falcon, Farewell My Lovely, The Big Sleep, and Chinatown. Well, he didn't talk about Chinatown, but Chinatown is an example of that private detective hard-boiled genre. And I like those films very much. But he also takes to task in that essay Agatha Christie. And based on the title, of course, he says, murders aren't puzzles. They rarely are so elaborate that it takes a sleuth of genius to solve them. Murders are typically about revenge, hate, money, love, and are quite simple, as the title would suggest. That being said, I still love Agatha Christie's stories as much as I love the private detective genre of Raymond Chandler, Dashiell Hammett, and movies like Chinatown. So what is it about these Agatha Christie movies? Their structure is consistent throughout from when she started writing right up till almost when she finished. And she created 2 characters to tell the story, or in another way, to solve the mystery that she had created at the beginning of these stories with a murder, of course. The first character she created was charmingly called Miss Marple. And at first I thought this was sort of semi-autobiographical. It's an older woman, a much older woman, almost her grandmother, who has a keen brain and a keen eye, and in many of the stories she wrote, solves the problems, solves the mysteries. And there have been almost so many of these stories have been brought to the screen, mostly the television screen. And I've seen a series that was created in the 1970s, I believe, that was just spectacular. And it starred an actress named Joan Hickson, who is my favorite Miss Marple. And my favorite story is a Caribbean mystery, which was shot on location in an island in the Caribbean, and I think just works really, really well. I like it a lot, and I like Miss Marple, and I also like the theme music from the series that aired in, I believe, the 1970s. They're still around. You can still see them through any kind of streaming media, and some of them might be a little bit slow, maybe a little bit dated, but some of the stories, what I consider the strongest stories, are as good today as they were when they were released. The other detective that Agatha Christie created, the most famous of the two, is a Belgian named Hercule Poirot. Now, the running joke in all of the Agatha Christie stories is that Hercule Poirot is not French, he is Belgian. For whatever reason, she decided to make that distinction, but it's fine and it works. But Poirot is an eccentric, funny looking, if it must be said, only so much as he has an oversized mustache, which was not unusual in the 20s and 30s, and he has a bit of a waddle to his walk for whatever reason. But he is her sleuth supreme, and he has appeared in the movies and in television. And another television series that I like very much that lasted 13 seasons and starred the actor David Suchet. And I think that series is spectacular. So many of the stories were brought to the screen in that series, including some that were made into movies, but were done on the smaller screen. And I think it just really, really works. I enjoy them immensely. There have been many of her stories made for the movies, and I think there is varying quality here. I've seen about 5 or 6 of them, and without a doubt, Murder on the Orient Express is my favorite, and I think perhaps the strongest entry into this catalog of films. There's even been a movie made recently of Agatha Christie's Murder on the Orient Express, but I like the 1974 release much, much more. I just think everything about it works very, very well. So that's Agatha Christie. That's our source material. And in Murder on the Orient Express, our detective is Hercule Poirot. And I think it illustrates all the great things about Agatha Christie's writing. Lots of characters, a great murder mystery, not a particularly violent murder at the beginning of the story. And most importantly for Agatha Christie stories, it is chock full of that magic thing called clues. And some of the fun of enjoying Agatha Christie stories is to try to find the clues that are early in the story, because there's always clues right from the beginning, and see if we, the audience, can't figure out who the killer is. And that's a great part of the fun of these murder mysteries that Agatha Christie wrote. And I think Murder on the Orient Express is an excellent example of her style. And of course, I think that the filmmaking, the execution of it into film is terrific. For what it's worth, Agatha Christie was still alive when this film was released in 1974, and she declared that it was her favorite adaptation of all her work. So take that for what it is. I just happen to think it's a terrific film and very much an example of Christie's style. Murder on the Orient Express begins with a story before the story, or a backstory. And it's not hard to see that the purpose of this is that the filmmakers want everybody to be up to speed on the backstory of our murder mystery. And so it tells a quick story. It takes about 3 minutes only, with a lot of black and white photos and a little bit of action, not too much, no dialogue, about a fictionalized version of something that actually happened in the early 1930s. And for that, we have to go back a few more years to talk about a very famous man. If Agatha Christie was the most famous author of the 20th century, this man arguably was the most famous man, at least for the first, say, 35 or 40 years of the 20th century, and that man was Charles Lindbergh. He was famous because as an aviator, he flew solo between New York and Paris in 1927, and that had never been done before. So he became an instant sensation. His picture was in all the papers around the world. It was a unique experience, and it really, according to what I've read, changed the world of aviation forever, ushering in eventually commercial aviation, and just making those distances smaller and smaller. But Lindbergh was good-looking guy, American, well-spoken, military man. I think he was, in the Navy, which was, the Air Force didn't exist at that time. It was part of the Navy. And he was a hero, beyond any hero that you can imagine, at least up to that point. So he was the most famous person in the world. He had a family, he had a wife and a couple of kids, and was living the life of a celebrity for a few years. But then in around 1932, something horrific happened to his family. And it's almost unimaginable to think that it could happen today. And that is, his youngest daughter was abducted, was kidnapped. And imagine today, pick your stars. There are many, many famous couples or families today. Pick anyone you want that might have children, and imagine what it would be like if someone kidnapped one of their children. It's almost impossible to conceive it today. It might have been impossible to conceive it in 1932, but it really did happen. There was a ransom note left very quickly after the abduction. Lindbergh paid the ransom, but unfortunately, about 6 weeks, 2 months later, the body of his daughter was found in the woods. And apparently she had died almost a couple of days at the most after she had been kidnapped. So this was an incredible crime. In fact, the newspapers, I think, quite rightly, labeled it the crime of the century. And certainly up to that point in the 20th century, it probably was. Certainly a personal tragedy beyond comprehension. And it wasn't until a few years later when there were many more incredible crimes of the century to happen. But by 1932, I think it was correctly labeled. So what our story has in Murder on the Orient Express is a fictionalized version of this kidnapping. Different names, of course. The still photography is all not from the actual events of the Lindbergh kidnapping. And it tells the story from start to finish, including all these details and a few more details. And it ends at the point where the baby has been found, or the child has been found. There was an arrest made a couple of years later. The individual who had been arrested did have in his possession some of the money of the ransom, because they recorded the serial numbers of all the bills, and he had used some of those bills in, I believe it was New York City. They found him, they tried him, they found him guilty, and they executed him. But what remained was, a lot of people didn't think that this man, whose name was Bruno Hauptmann, was the brains behind this kidnapping, because it was just required so much expertise to get away with it, so to speak, and they didn't think that he was that smart a fellow. He was a laborer, a carpenter or something. So part of the interest in the Lindbergh kidnapping, and in our story as well, is that, was the actual culprit, the brains behind the kidnapping, apprehended? And the answer to that question is probably not. So that's our 3-minute introduction into the movie that describes the fictionalized account of a terribly tragic kidnapping. This is important. We're not sure why after this 3 minutes is over, but we figure it's got to be important to the story. So it's just, there it is, it's done. And now the scene shifts from these mostly black and white photographs and a few color shots now to our actual movie that begins about 5 minutes into the film. I say 3 minutes for the story because the credits run about 2 minutes right at the very beginning. And our story, part 2, after this prologue, so to speak, begins in Istanbul, Turkey. And we see a car pull up, a car of the period. It looks like a rather expensive car. And a lady gets out and walks along the pier and gets into this ferry. And the titles tell us that this is 1935 and we're on the eastern side, the Asian side of Istanbul. Another character goes onto the ferry, and these two people know each other, and they say a few things that give us an indication that something is about to happen at some point in our movie. Also on this ferry, upstairs, is our friend Hercule Poirot. Now, do we know it's him? We don't, but our Englishman, who is a military man, he's actually Scottish, of course, because it's an actor I'll talk about in a second. He makes a very disparaging remark about this character on the upper level of the ferry because he looks French. So but immediately after that, there's another military man who's on the ferry who is escorting this man, who we find out, of course, is Hercule Poirot, because he's just done a job for the British Army in Jordan, and he's on his way back to Europe. So this ferry is very nice. There's a couple of very good comedic moments. We only are introduced to these three characters, the military man, the young woman, and Hercule, and we're going across the Bosphorus to the western side of Istanbul, which is where the connection is for the Orient Express train that travels between the western side of Istanbul all the way to France and the Pas-de-Calais, where travelers who are going on to London, which is the destination for many of them, would take the ferry across the English Channel. So we cross the Bosphorus. There's a hotel that is probably owned by the rail line that Poirot is staying at until he has to take the train. We find out very quickly that he has to take the train that very night. He's been summoned to London on an urgent matter. But at this dinner he's having, he meets an old friend who happens to be one of the directors of the line. So they talk and they exchange, oh, I'm going back to London too. Oh, we're going to have a traveling companion. Isn't this nice? And we learn a little bit about these two gentlemen. And then there's a clue. And I won't tell you what the clue is, but there's something odd which the director of the line comments on, but it's no matter. It's nothing, as all good clues are. It doesn't mean anything at the time, but if we look back on it, we think, well, that was interesting, wasn't it? So we only see one other character of note in this dinner, and it's the camera is telling us that there's a rather nasty looking fellow who's taking in the scene, and he's looking at the table where the director of the line and Poirot are having dinner. And that's it, nothing more, really. And so the next thing we see is the train station where people are getting on board the Orient Express. And of course there's a first class car, and it is in December, we are told. And there are very few travelers on this train in December, but the train is busy. And this is a terrific plot device to introduce us to all the characters we're going to follow for the rest of the movie. We have, of course, we've already seen the director of the line, we've already seen Poirot, but we see all the other characters that are going to be involved with the story, who are all in the first class compartment. So we get little snippets of each one, we get a sense of them, who they are, what their nationalities are. The train captain or the coachman or whatever you call him, who greets them and lets them know what their cabin is, speaks multiple languages. We find out that there's someone from Russia, from Hungary, France, of course, Belgium, America, and Great Britain. Germany, I'm sorry, there's also German spoken there. So there's a lot of languages. He speaks them all, he greets them all. We get a sense of who everybody is, and then everybody gets on the train. And away the train goes. It is considered, the Orient Express is considered a character in this movie, as I guess it should be, because the rest of the action now is going to take place on the train. And that's another element of Christie's stories, that it's always better to have a finite space with finite characters rather than having half a dozen different cities where the action takes place and one or two characters only. Here we have a train. All the people that we're going to be interested in are on that train. There's about 14, 15 people in total on the train, at least from the first class car. And so everything's nice and tight and contained, and our story begins just at the time when the train leaves the station. So there's one other element that takes place that is important to the plot, very important to the plot, and this is also based on something that actually happened. Apparently around this time in the early 30s, there was a heavy snowstorm that affected the Orient Express to the extent that the train was blocked from advancing because there was a massive snowdrift that could not easily be moved, not by shovels and a couple of people. It was much, much bigger than that. So it took the train 3 or 4 days to actually get clear of the snowdrift by having another train full of, I guess, laborers and mechanical devices at the front of the train to plow the snowdrift. And so that actually happened in the early 30s. And this also happens in our story, which again heightens the storytelling because now they're stuck. It's no spoiler to know that there's a murder at the beginning of this story, very early on in the story, as in every single murder mystery, especially of Agatha Christie's. There's a murder that takes place very early on, and now no one can move because the train is blocked. So there's two possibilities. Somebody got on the train, committed the murder, and got off the train, or somebody on the train committed the murder and they aren't going anywhere. So this is a great plot device to really heighten the suspense of the story and focuses on the whodunit. We've got somebody who's dead, and now we got to find out why, and maybe, just maybe, it's one of the passengers on the train. Now there's a cautionary note for murder mysteries that have been adapted from Agatha Christie stories. One of the successful elements of Agatha Christie stories is there are many, many characters in those stories, which means many, many potential suspects. What fun is it in a murder mystery if there's only 1 or 2 characters in the story and it's either this person or that person? What if there's half a dozen? What if there's a dozen? What if there's 15 potential suspects? This makes for more fun of a story for us, the audience, trying to figure out who done it. Now here's the caution. We need to find out who all these characters are. They have to be uniquely identified. We have to be able to differentiate one from the other. So there has to be men and women, maybe children, maybe much older adults. Different nationalities help. They got to look different. You can't have 2 brunettes who are 22 years old, and you can't have 2 45-year-old very distinguished men with dark hair and a mustache. That doesn't work. So it's very important that when making the film, you have to be able to identify all the characters and make sure that everyone is different from the other so that the audience doesn't get confused. And the caution is that this takes time. This isn't a lot of action. This is almost all dialogue. And there's a brilliant way that Murder on the Orient Express does this. I won't go into details, but it's thanks to our detective who was trying to figure out this murder, Hercule Poirot. And so we do learn about each individual character on this train. We learn about where they're from, some of their background, in some cases a lot of their background, and it solves this problem quite nicely. Because A, it takes time for this to happen, so it has to be entertaining when we find out who they are. And the other caution is, if it takes too much time, the pacing of the movie slows down and the audience gets bored. Let's go, let's get on with it, please. Or there's no action. There's not a huge body count. It's just, there's usually one, although in Agatha Christie's case, sometimes one can lead to 4, 5, or 6 murders, but the body count is still small. And so that's a danger for the audience. The other danger is, oh, well, we got to be careful of the pace. We can't go too slow. We can't take too much time. And then what happens is the movie makers go too fast, and very quickly the audience is saying, who's that person? Who's that person? I can't remember. Where did they come from? And that one looks like that one. And so there's all those problems as well. So again, it's the execution of the film that is very critical that these cautions are overcome. And of course, I think a Murder on the Orient Express, they are overcome brilliantly. And we do get a feeling for each character, each potential suspect. And there's a bit of a running joke in the early part of this murder mystery where the director of the line thinks that this person is guilty, and then 2 minutes later thinks that person's guilty, and 2 minutes later thinks that person's guilty, which is what we think too. As we are introduced to each of the characters on the train, maybe they did it. Again, the fun of a whodunit is trying to figure out who done it. So Murder on the Orient Express embraces a large number of potential suspects, identifies them uniquely, takes just the right amount of time to expose them to the audience, and therefore we don't feel bored and we don't feel lost, like who's who, and it works very, very well. And that leads us to casting. Because if all these unique characters have been identified, now we've got to fill those roles with people who are also unique. And it was, I don't know when it began, maybe in the 60s. I think it was in the 60s when there were big movie projects that had a lot of moving parts to them, a lot of supporting roles, lead roles, that occasionally they would populate those roles with very, very familiar faces. Not always, but sometimes. I think of a movie made in the early 60s called The Longest Day, about the invasion of Europe on June 6, 1944. That was full of cameos of very famous actors from Hollywood, from Europe. It was, maybe that was the beginning of it, I'm not really sure. But for this movie, the casting, of course, was critical. I'm going to add my own caution here and say that all the movies I like, of course, I think are very effectively acted. The roles are done convincingly. I like who the casting people selected, whether it was the director himself or the casting person. The result I've often found was terrific. For my favorite films, I don't have any complaints about any of the actors or actresses that were chosen for the roles they're in. So perhaps it's not enough to say they did a terrific job. All of these professionals in the movies I like have done a terrific job. It almost goes without saying, but I don't think it should go without saying. But where is the brilliance? The brilliance, I think, is in the powers that be. Because even if you put together 5 or 6 fantastic actors and actresses with healthy resumes who are darlings of the movie-going public, they can still make less than satisfactory movies. Something can go wrong. Maybe the direction doesn't extract the best performance. Maybe there's interference from the producers. Maybe it's just not the right time for a terrific actor or actress to be in that role. There's a lot of ways that these people cannot give the performances that we hope they are going to give. And so not all films are as successful as they could be, despite the fact they have tremendous casts. So I will say, for all of the movies I like, one of the consistent elements is the casting has been terrific. Kudos to whatever number of people are involved in selecting these actors and actresses. Murder on the Orient Express is certainly no exception. And it is, once again, incredibly critical because there are about 15 speaking parts of very importance in this film. And you can't have anybody who isn't doing their thing, who isn't convincing, who isn't believable, who doesn't mesh with the other characters. The script is terrific. I haven't read the story by Agatha Christie, but I have to assume that the screenplay mirrors the book quite well, because I've seen 2 other versions of Murder on the Orient Express where the storyline was pretty much exactly the same in each one. So let's give the credit to Agatha Christie. But whatever the screenwriter chose for the movie, what they chose to keep and not to keep, it works very, very well. So we've got all these characters in this film. It's got to be cast just so. Let's start with Hercule Poirot. He is the lead. He is the star of the film. Everybody else in the movie who has a lot of screen time, they would be considered co-stars, supporting stars, but not the star. It's Albert Finney is the actor who plays Hercule Poirot in our film. And he had been a successful star in the 60s. He began with a bang. I don't know if it was his first film, but he did really well in an early 60s film called Tom Jones, based on a Victorian novel, and was very well acclaimed in that. He had a really illustrious career. He was a busy guy, and modern moviegoers might remember him, if they do, as the lawyer in Erin Brockovich. So that's Albert Finney, and I think he does a tremendous job as Hercule Poirot. It's really easy to overact this character because he is eccentric and he looks a little funny. And if you've seen a more recent version of this film, you might think that that was the case. However, in our film, I love what Finney does, and I think he's perfectly believable, very effective, and it really is a command performance. For our supporting characters, of which there are many, let's take a look at some of the people involved. We have the most critical one. Again, I looked it up a few places, and they said that when they get these all-star casts, these very famous faces that they all put into the same movie, sometimes it takes one hire to make all the other hires work. And in this case, that hire was Sean Connery. Now, in 1973, 1974, Connery was as famous an actor as there was in the entire world for two words: James Bond. He was, of course, the first James Bond, and even though he had made most of the Bond films throughout the 60s, there were a couple still to go in the 70s, but his fame began in the 60s, and he was a very, very recognizable actor. He had a wonderful career still to come. He made many terrific films in the next 20 years, but he was definitely at his peak in 1974, and he would have been instantly recognizable by the movie-going public. And as I understand it, once they assigned Connery, the powers that be for this film, they pretty much had their pick and choose of whoever else they wanted, because everybody would say yes, because, well, if Sean Connery is going to do this film, and I'm going to do this film. So we have an actress named Vanessa Redgrave, who had also had a terrific start of her career in the 60s. She was Guinevere in Camelot, but she was in a film that I like very, very much, and I will speak about later in this series, that is just an extraordinary film called Blow Up. And she has a medium-sized role in that film, and that film is an example of how the camera tells a story. And it's just a wonderful film, and she is in that movie and was noticed, of course. She has a very famous father, Michael Redgrave, who is of that age of another actor I'll mention in a second, but she was very recognizable in 1974. We have Lauren Bacall, who plays a 50-something, let's say, woman in this film. Her fame was in the 40s and 50s, late 40s and throughout the 50s, for two reasons. One, she made some terrific movies, no two ways about it, lots of good films in the late 40s. And two, she was married to a legend of Hollywood, Humphrey Bogart. She survived his passing in the middle 50s. He died relatively young from, I think it might have been lung cancer or something. So she hadn't done a lot in the last 10 years, and she certainly wasn't the star she was in the 40s and 50s, but she was recognizable. And she is in this film and is completely believable as this noisy American. We have Michael York, who I've spoken about recently because he was in the 1968 movie Romeo and Juliet, and so his face would have been very recognizable. He was also in 1972's, I think, Cabaret, the first film I spoke about in this series. So he would have been a very recognizable face, still very young, still a very much a darling of the movie-going public. There was a woman, the youngest woman in the cast, Jacqueline Bisset, maybe mid-20s, gorgeous, of course, for whatever polls are taken, one of the most beautiful women in the world at this time. And she plays a person of royalty, does it very well, doesn't have to do too much, but she does it well and very convincing. We have an older gentleman whose name was John Gielgud, who was another, if not a legend of Hollywood, certainly a legend in acting of this school that included Laurence Olivier, Michael Redgrave, himself, John Gielgud. There were so many of that ilk in the 50s, Shakespearean trained, terrific actors, and he would go on to have a wonderful career for the next 15 years. No matter how old he was, he kept cropping up in the movies and doing a terrific job. So John Gielgud is here. We have a lesser actor who has the director of the line, who I like very much. His name is Martin Balsam, and we've already seen him in a film called 7 Days in May, where he is a character in that film. He was a terrific actor, again a supporting actor throughout his career, but doing terrific work, and I like him very, very much in this movie. I think he is perfectly cast as the director of the line, but his biggest claim to fame, despite being in 7 Days in May, which I think is an exceptional film, and this one, he was in a movie directed by Alfred Hitchcock called Psycho. And almost every moviegoer who cares about movies and who likes good films knows about Psycho. and he was in that film. And in fact, he's been on record as saying, when people meet me, they often refer to me as that guy in Psycho. So he was also equally recognizable. There are more. Anthony Perkins was in Psycho. He's in this film. And another favorite actress of mine, Wendy Hiller, who I spoke about a few episodes ago, her first film was Pygmalion. She was very young, maybe 25. It was released in 1938, and I spoke about Pygmalion when I talked about My Fair Lady. So here's Wendy Hiller 25 years later. She was 62, 35 years later. She was 62 in this film, but she plays another royal personage, a Russian royal personage, in her 80s, so they had to make her much older. But she is incredibly convincing. She's funny. She's got a great character to play. She's got some good lines, very witty, and also absolutely central to the storytelling of Murder on the Orient Express. And the other character who has a very minor role that I should mention is Ingrid Bergman. Now, Ingrid Bergman was in my favorite film of all time, Casablanca, released in 1941. Well, she had a very good career in the 40s, made some really terrific films, I thought, very watchable films. Tapered off a bit in the 50s and kind of disappeared after that. She was in Europe, made some films in Europe. There's a lot of noise about her career. You can look it up if you so choose. But she came either out of retirement or somehow wasn't very busy, and she was asked to be in this movie again because a lot of people from her era almost were in this movie. And she agreed to play, of all people, Swedish. She was Swedish by birth, this Swedish character, which was very well received. She got all kinds of acclamation for this role. She does a nice job. I don't think she does particularly any better than the other characters in the film, but it's a very good, well done. And she was, again, an enormous star in Hollywood for, let's say, sake of argument, 15 years at least. One of my favorite actresses in the movies that she made in the 40s, and does another very nice role here, rounding out this incredible all-star cast. So the casting, again, they're all pros. They all had terrific resumes, very recognizable faces for the most part. And the ones who weren't as recognizable as these other almost legends of the film world all do their jobs, all work nicely in this ensemble cast to help to tell this tremendous story, this tremendous murder mystery. So this is Murder on the Orient Express. We have a really good story. We have an exotic location, not only Istanbul, which we see for a few minutes, not very long, but we have the exotic train, the Orient Express train, the most expensive train at the time to take, even if you weren't traveling first class. We learned very early on in the film how gorgeous it is. We see the food being loaded onto the train, the massive amounts of meat and fish and oysters and fruits and vegetables. In the dining car, we see the cutlery and the glassware, which means, there's a massive amount of wine and spirits on the train. Looks like crystal glassware. It just is very sumptuous. We have a whole bunch of characters, very unique characters, royalty, working men, military people, and of course we have Poirot. And the trick of the movie is that nobody knew, including the audience, and the trick of the film is that Poirot wasn't supposed to be on the train. He got a last-minute request from London, however, by telegram probably, saying that they needed him in London right away. So he's a last-minute addition to the train, which is very critical to the telling of this story. And that's, of course, we see the unfolding of the mystery through Poirot's eyes. And in fact, there's another element to Agatha Christie storytelling which is not lost in this film. And that is when the character, whether it's Miss Marple, whether it's Poirot, whether it's another one of the lesser detectives that Christie invented, discovers who the murderer is, the structure of her stories is to bring all the potential suspects together into one place and have the detective tell everybody what he or she has discovered and then point the finger at the killer. This is very standard. It appears in many, many murder mysteries made many years after Agatha Christie wrote these stories, and it's kind of fun, but it definitely falls into this puzzle fiction murder structure. But what is noteworthy of this is the last 20 of the minutes of this film is all Poirot. And so it's a tour de force acting by Albert Finney, but it's also tremendous acting on behalf of all the characters in the first class car, because they have to sit there and look interested for the 20 minutes of film time, which apparently took days to shoot. And so they have to be in character and say nothing for the last 20 minutes of the film, virtually nothing until the final moments of the film. So Murder on the Orient Express gives us all the elements for an incredibly enjoyable movie experience. We have a tremendous story. We have a tremendous cast. We have the execution of this story such that we just don't know what's going to happen. We might think we know who the killer is, but chances are, given how good this story is, the audience probably doesn't. And so the last few minutes of the film is a tremendous expose of what actually has gone on this train. So I enjoy this movie every time I watch it, even though I know how it ends. I love the execution of the film. I love how it looks. I love seeing all these actors doing their thing. And I enjoyed it even this time around as I sat back, relaxed, and watched yet again Murder on the Orient Express from the 22nd row.